What's the point of fantasy? As with any question about the value of something, there are countless ways you might want to answer that. For some, the clue is right there in the genre title. It's all about escapism and distraction, a comforting source of relief from an unpleasant reality, and any time spent thinking deeply about what it really means can only subtract from its tranquilizing power. I won't say that the people enjoying fantasy in this way are wrong, because all media contains at least some element of distraction by virtue of being fictional. But I would guess that the number of artists who would proudly say their work was made with pure escapism in mind is a very small one. It takes a little more conviction than that to spend years of your existence working on bringing an idea or a world to life. So maybe we can get a little closer to the point of fantasy by looking at its origins in the ancient mythologies that gave us the gods, monsters, elves, fairies and dragons that populate the genre today. Part of the purpose of those myths was to provide an explanation for why the world looked the way it did, where the mountains, the seas and the beasts of the wild came from, but they also made an attempt at explaining why people behaved the way they do. To that end, those ancient stories supplied a relatable cast of characters whose personalities fit into tropes that could be used to paint lessons onto a big allegorical canvas. Beware the hubris of Icarus. Keep telling lies and you'll end up like Loki. Don't go into the woods alone or you'll meet the big bad wolf. Simple enough lessons, and this is not to say that every story needs an obvious moral in order to be worthwhile. My point is more about relatability. As a bare minimum, you need to be able to see yourself reflected back somehow in order to find a tale meaningful. This need for relatability is surely why the gods of so many ancient mythologies have distinctly human forms, as well as human vices and weaknesses. We made them in our own image after all. A more recent take on fantasy, like Berserk or A Song of Ice and Fire, may contain more than its fair share of supernatural or fanciful elements, but they remain quite relatable because just like in those ancient myths, at their root, they're ultimately based in simple human relationships, and the loves, betrayals and ambitions that blossom out of them. Without that sympathetic core, I'd argue that any narrative will end up falling flat, fantasy or otherwise. And so, when a fantastical story isn't particularly relatable and doesn't really have anything to say about life in the world we actually live in, well, what's the point of the fantasy? Metaphor ReFantazio is the latest offering from the RPG heavyweights at Atlus, and after a spree of playing through the mainline Persona games, I was curious to see what the most recent manifestation of their ideas looked like, especially given that it won a bunch of awards last year. To its credit, Metaphor shakes up the Persona formula enough to be well worth commenting on. There's a reason I'm making a video about this game and didn't bother to do so for Persona 3 or 4. Among these differences are an overhaul of the turn-based combat, which now sees you assigning specific roles to each character from a class tree, a change to the overall structure, which has you travelling across the world rather than staying in one place for the game's duration, and perhaps most notably, you're no longer playing as a Japanese student. Instead, you play as a boy in a newly imagined fantasy setting, competing in a tournament that will determine the next ruler of the kingdom. Metaphor's central concept of a race against time, against a number of interesting rivals, and across a fantastical landscape with plenty to marvel at and get distracted by, is a very captivating one, and apart from the shared focus on time management, it diverges quite a lot from Persona. I will always applaud an attempt at trying something fresh or breaking out of an old formula that's become stifling, and my respect goes out to the devs who took the risk on a new project. But the thing is, I don't think they went far enough, and they ended up playing it way too safe. While Metaphor does have plenty that distinguishes it from Persona, at the same time it's also held back by features that are thoughtlessly carried over from that series, with seemingly no regard for whether they make sense in this new context. And in case it isn't clear, I don't think they do. These borrowed features pull off the double whammy of bringing absolutely nothing new to the table while also undermining the actually new ideas that don't have the breathing room to reach their full potential because the game is stuck trying to bend itself around a skeleton it inherited from another series. With this mismatch between new ambition and old tradition, Metaphor is missing a thematic through-line and isn't able to fully deliver on the potential of its concept, and as a result, it doesn't really feel like it's about anything. By the time the credits finally rolled after 100 hours, I found myself questioning what the point of it all was, and I mostly came up short. Metaphor is not a bad game by any means, but it failed completely to live up to the expectations that it gave me early on, and in between some occasional flashes of brilliance, the feeling that it left me with more than any other was disappointment. I think that about does it for an introductory summary, so here's a spoiler warning in case you want to check out Metaphor yourself before watching further. In terms of whether I'd recommend it or not, that depends on your previous experience with RPGs. If you haven't played Persona 5, you should just do that instead, and then walk away to save yourself another 100 hours. If you're an RPG fanatic and somehow haven't played Metaphor yet, you'll probably get enough mileage out of figuring out the intricacies of the new combat system for it to be worth the price of entry. It's not essential, but you might want to watch my Persona video before this one if you want a bit more context on my thoughts about RPGs and the similarities between that series and Metaphor. Alright, that's the admin, let's get started. So I think the best place to start here is with what I see as the most disappointing side of the game. The story, the setting, the characters, and the way the player interacts with all of those things, or not, through their choices. Basically everything except the combat system, which is pretty much separate from the rest of the game anyway, and deserves to have its own half of the video devoted to it later on. To quickly summarise the premise of Metaphor, it's set in a fantasy kingdom whose king has just been assassinated, and with his last gasp of royal magic, he sets in motion a competition to determine who will rule next. The competitor with the most popular support by the deadline in a few months' time will be crowned. You play as a close friend of the old king's son, the prince, who's bedridden due to a curse placed on him years ago, so you enter the tournament on his behalf and try to get him to the top spot. In the last quarter of the game, it turns out that you were actually the prince the whole time after all, which is a pointless twist of absolutely no consequence, but that's far from my biggest complaint about the game's narrative, so I won't dwell on it. The tournament sees you travelling all the way around the kingdom in your Land Runner, following the calendar deadline of each leg of the competition, and completing side quests, encountering rival claimants, improving your royal virtues, and forming bonds with allies along the way, all under the pressure of an ever-present time limit. Like in Persona, this time limit takes the form of a daily number of time slots rather than an actual ticking timer. You have 2 slots to use per day on improving your relationships or improving yourself, and entering a dungeon will always take up a full day. Again, this is all exactly how it works in Persona, so no surprises so far. What's new in Metaphor, however, is the added wrinkle of having to travel between destinations on the map, which is never a concern in Persona because it all takes place in one location. This travel almost always costs you some time, and it often takes multiple days to get to a side quest destination, and that travel time doesn't just disappear with the game cutting to your arrival several days later. You actually play through the journey, using your usual 2 daily time slots on the road, and spending them either on your companions or on yourself. As I hope you'll agree, there are some very compelling ideas in Metaphor's main concept, particularly in the question of travel, which adds another dimension to the time management mechanics inherited from Persona, and means that there's sometimes a need to efficiently plan routes between destinations in order to visit them all using as little time as possible. While Persona benefits greatly from being set in a single location that you spend a year in, observing it changing through the seasons and occasionally reacting to your exploits, Metaphor at its core is a road trip story, and as long as you hit the main story beats in time for each deadline, you're free to travel where you please, learning more about the world, its inhabitants, and its history with every passing encounter. Or at least, that's what I'd like to say, because already just a couple of minutes into this section, I need to begin breaking down why I think Metaphor completely fails to live up to that concept. And unfortunately, I don't need to look far past the game's opening hours to start picking examples. When my party first set out from the starting location after the intro, I was expecting the remainder of the game to be a dangerous journey across an intriguing and fraught landscape, a sort of mix between Persona and Banner Saga. Travelling in a tight-knit band, making difficult choices and hard trips between hostile locations, meeting friends and foes along the way, but always proceeding in one direction, with your path and your choices all laid out behind you like a timeline of your journey. I was pretty excited by the prospect of a game like that, and I still am, because Metaphor completely squanders its potential as a road trip story, and that prospect continues to exist only in my head. Here's why. Immediately after leaving the first major location on the map, you unlock the power to instantaneously and freely teleport between main hubs, and the moment this happened, my heart sank so low it became a kidney. What this teleportation means is that you're not really travelling across the kingdom in any meaningful sense as the story progresses. You're actually just unlocking new spots on the map, all of which can be visited whenever you like at 0 cost. I trust it's obvious why the ability to teleport completely undermines the road trip narrative. You're not venturing out on a meaningful journey if you can return to your starting point with a snap of your fingers whenever you like. Just before you leave the first city to set out on your fateful voyage, there's a tearful goodbye with one of the first Bond characters you meet, Maria. And this scene in particular is cheapened to the point of farce when only moments later you unlock teleportation. The concept of distance is removed from the game entirely, and you can return to visit Maria anytime you like for free. But the ability to teleport doesn't only devalue the relationships you have with bonded characters, oh no. It can also be used to instantly return back to a hub after completing a distant dungeon, meaning that efficient route planning on the map isn't really much of a concern after all. Weirdly, it seems like the devs may have had a similar realization themselves midway through development, because there's only one region of the map that has anything like an interconnected network of destinations with multiple paths running through it. All the other regions just have destinations placed as single spokes coming out of their hub, and after reaching them and completing their dungeon, you just teleport right back, so the devs must have given up on the idea of route planning at some point. The ability to trivialize distance by teleporting is sadly emblematic of the total lack of consequences to your actions anywhere in the game, and that lack of consequences is chiefly responsible for my disappointment with Metaphor. That feeling of disappointment set in early into my playthrough, and for many other reasons that I'll go on to explain, it never really went away. The variety of the areas you're allowed to explore is seriously lacking, especially in the dungeons, which are incredibly dull and have their designs reused often. Get used to seeing the same forests and catacombs over and over again. The dungeons that actually make an effort to be unique can be quite cool, with the intestine of a giant worm being one of my highlights, but these are few and far between. In a total slap to the face, one dungeon in particular is hyped up as a remnant of the ancient world that's been left behind on a floating island in the sky, and when you finally get up there, it looks exactly the same as all the other dungeons. This feels like a bad joke, and the punchline is the player's disappointment. Also sorely lacking in variety are the activities available in each major hub for raising your royal virtues, Metaphor's version of Persona's social stats that level up slowly over the course of a playthrough. Some locations you visit have unique ways of increasing these stats, which is a nice touch, like Martira's cliffside dive that raises your courage. But listening to old people, talking to activists, or learning about the customs of religious minorities aren't exactly inspired ways to raise your wisdom, eloquence, and tolerance, and they get a bit tedious once you realize the exact same options are present in every town you visit. And, because travel is only an illusion in this game, you're able to teleport back to all the previous towns anyway, so what's the point of presenting identical options in different locations? Your options are even further restricted while passing time on the road, where reading and rereading the same handful of books gets old very fast. But look, it's not all bad, and I want to offer a reminder that I see a lot of potential in Metaphor's central concept of travelling on a time limit, along with some thoughts on how that potential could have been better realised. The unique landmarks that you occasionally pass by and take mementos of throughout your journey are a really nice little touch that expose a bit of the world's history in a way that feels quite natural, and I would love to say that they contribute greatly to the road trip feeling of the narrative if, the game hadn't thrown the possibility of a road trip story out the window right at the beginning. And of course it goes without saying that it would have been nice to actually investigate them for myself rather than just looking at a postcard of them. I think a part of the problem here is that discovering new locations or landmarks isn't something that happens organically as you freely explore the world, because you can't freely explore the world. Destinations are simply dropped onto your map whenever you pick up a new side quest, and with everything shown to you on the map ahead of time, there isn't really any discovery to be done in the sense of encountering something unexpected. A more open-ended travel system could have made exploration a lot more engaging. Maybe something like the map in the original Fallout, which shows the points of interest you've heard about but with a fog surrounding them and covering unexplored areas until you pass through. Stumbling across a scenic vista or a hidden dungeon would be a genuine surprise in a map like that, and it would enhance the feeling of setting out on a dangerous journey into the unknown, a feeling which is sorely missing from Metaphor. And while I'm borrowing ideas from other games, if the devs really wanted to light a fire behind the player and motivate them to get moving, then a wave of monsters moving across the map behind them, sort of like the rebels chasing you in FTL, could have enhanced the race against time and the heightening danger that are implied by the narrative but not really felt by the player. We're told that monsters are ravaging the land in ever-increasing numbers, but everywhere visited by the player ends up having far fewer monsters, not more. We're given deadlines and told to use our limited time carefully, but since you always proceed to the next hub region on a predefined date, and those deadlines always provide ample time to complete all the side quests, bounties and character meetings in each location, you very rarely feel the pressure of time management that was ever present in Persona. And even if you do miss some side quests before the deadline moves you onto a new area, I'm sure you haven't forgotten that you can still always teleport back there later for free. I assume that the reason the devs felt the need to include this teleportation feature is simply because they'd carried over the social bond system from Persona and needed the player to be able to go back to previous settlements and continue visiting their bonded characters to max out their relationships. Again, this totally devalues the fleeting and temporary nature of meeting people on the road that gives those encounters their importance in the first place, but it can also result in some very silly and nonsensical situations. Barden, the Bond character who ends up as the reluctant governor of Martira, the second major hub, has one of his Bond chapters end with a giant human worm attacking the settlement. Predictably, you can wait as long as you like before choosing to teleport over and respond to it in his next chapter, so there's zero sense of urgency, no consequences for putting it off, and no reason to take it seriously, a complaint that, sadly, I can apply to pretty much every companion's side story. We also meet the Bond character Alonso in Martira, when the naive protagonist gets pickpocketed and Alonso offers to help you get your stuff back, if you have enough points in your imagination stat to persuade him to do so, that is. I have no problem with any of that, but what makes it fall flat for me is the fact that Alonso will patiently wait here every day and every night for the rest of time until your imagination stat is high enough to speak to him. On top of being very stupid, this is yet another concession that undermines any chance the game could have had of its time limit or travel mechanics being taken seriously. Once you've met a Bond character for the first time and begun a friendship with them, you don't have to go out of your way for them or spend time travelling to see them that could have been spent going somewhere else. Instead, you literally just teleport right in front of their face from a menu whenever the game tells you it's time to go and level up their relationship, which even further erases any notion that time or distance really play any role in Metaphor. Now, I know the reason that it's necessary for Alonso to wait here for you forever is because talking to him and establishing a bond is how you unlock his archetype, this game's version of personas which can be assigned to party members however you choose, and the game can't allow you to miss out on something so essential. More on that later when I get into how combat works. For now, my point is simply that maybe it wasn't a good idea to carry over the bond system from Persona into a game that isn't set in one consistent location, and there was really no reason to do so besides the fact that it was easy for the devs to do. If it is the case that teleportation was only introduced in order to accommodate the bond system, then carrying that over from Persona may well have been the worst decision made during development. Yeah, this script is coming out really negative, isn't it? I think it's time for another reminder that things didn't necessarily have to be this way, and that there's a lot of promise in what Metaphor brings to the table. I should point out that not every Bond relationship lets you teleport right up to them by scrolling through a menu, only 90% of them do. One of the Bond characters, Katharina, is a rival claimant in the Royal Tournament, which means that she's on the same journey you are, in a landrunner of her own, and when you meet her on the road, it's because you've gone out of your way and actually spent some travel time to see her. This kind of investment is what the other Bond characters are missing, and one simple way to solve that problem would be to make all of the Bond characters your rivals in the competition. That way, you wouldn't need to teleport around to see them, since they'd already be on the same journey around the kingdom as you and would always be within plausible riding distance. If a few more connecting pathways between destinations were put on the map, then there could have been a bit of decision making to do in order to plan your route to see the characters you wanted to see while also visiting your destinations. In the game as it is now, even without them being Bond characters, encountering rivals on the road is almost always a highlight of travelling, since, like the landmarks you can discover, it feels like a natural way of providing a bit of exposition about the game world and the hopes and fears of its inhabitants. Inhabitants such as the handsome man, the Nazi elf, and let's see here. Oh yeah, Roger the Libertarian. As you can see, these rivals are all a bit bland and one-dimensional, so a little more attention couldn't have hurt. And spending time with them makes a hell of a lot more sense for the narrative than spending time with a random con man that you met on the street. And speaking of being bland and one-dimensional, I might as well complain about the quality of the companion side stories while I'm here. Simply put, they're kind of shit. They're full of unnamed characters who appear for one scene before vanishing, and pointless diversions that are never relevant again, and I just couldn't bring myself to care about any of them. I'm sorry to keep picking on this guy, but did I really need to see Alonso's unnamed mother die in his arms after meeting him exactly 3 times? It all just feels a bit silly. The fact that these side stories see you constantly teleporting all over the place mid-chapter only makes a further mockery of the road trip narrative, but I think I've made my point about teleportation clear enough by now. The only companion or party member with an arc that I gave a shit about, actually the only companion with a character arc that concerns the player in any way, was the Scouse furry Baz. And yes, I swear I'm not making this up.
You serious?
For reasons too boring to get into, he and his brother Del end up tagging along for part of your journey, but initially both of them hate you and mistrust you. That kind of interpersonal tension can make for great dialogue in the hands of a good writer, and to its credit, the game mostly delivers on that potential. This cold state of affairs carries on for quite a while, at least a quarter of the game, and you feel it for yourself every time you go and speak to them, which makes the slow burn of them defrosting and opening up to you over time one of the only rewarding parts of the story. It also contributes nicely to the feeling of being on a road trip or journey, where your companions of the day may not always be the ones you see eye to eye with. Their steady change of character culminates when the brothers turn on their master, the main villain Luis, and defy his orders in defense of some powerless civilians, leading to Del's death and Baz joining you as your final party member. It's not a mind-blowing or even a particularly original character arc, but it's at least successful at carrying and involving the player through the stages of animosity, empathy, and eventual fellowship with the relevant characters. Sadly, once this main story beat had passed and Baz became just another party member with his own side story to complete, all the stakes disappeared and I stopped caring again. I think diving a bit deeper into the difference between a main story arc and one of these companion side stories could help to illuminate why I accepted the former while at best tolerating the latter, and could reveal some insights relevant for Persona too, as for the most part I didn't care much for the confidant stories there either. The most obvious difference is that progress through a side story will only occur at the player's explicit request by going up to a companion and choosing to spend a time slot on them. Compare that to a non-optional main story arc, which could be advanced or affected by any narrative development, whether the player is expecting it or not. A main story scene can juggle multiple plot threads and accomplish multiple things at once, like introducing a new threat while also letting us see different characters' responses to it and their interactions with each other. In the companion scenes, which are completely siloed off from the rest of the narrative and don't even feature any of the other characters, advancing the stale and predictable side story by one chapter is the only narrative function that scene can possibly be allowed to serve, and as a result, there's no potential for anything surprising or interesting to happen. This is why each side story has to keep introducing and then disposing of nameless and lifeless characters to act as foils for whichever companion we're supposed to be spending time with. Just like in Persona, once you've finished a character's side story, there's no point in spending time with them ever again, and in most cases they could disappear from the narrative altogether with nothing being lost, making it very difficult to care about these characters. As if to try and force it, or maybe just to rub it in, the game actually makes you do 2 victory laps at the end, where you go around talking to everybody one last time, once before and once after the final boss. Before long, attending to these characters and their side stories starts to feel like a chore, and you might as well just fast forward through each one because there's nothing to be gained by paying attention. I say fast forward through them because they can't be outright ignored, since progressing each companion's story chapter by chapter is how you unlock new perks, abilities, and archetypes, making them pretty much mandatory for completion. This means that the player has a limited amount of input in which order those new combat options are unlocked, by choosing which side stories to advance first. But in the grand scheme of things, I don't think this decision really makes a meaningful difference to the player's experience. Many companion chapters require a royal virtue of a certain level before they can be advanced, say a wisdom stat of 4 or higher, which means that while you're waiting for your virtues to slowly level up across a playthrough, you might as well just take care of the companion stories that are available with your current stats. There is a narrow band of choice in which the player can express their preferences or priorities, but that band only gets narrower the closer you get to the end of the game and start maxing everything out. Since you have more than enough days and time slots in a playthrough to do this, by the game's conclusion you'll have everything unlocked, and the order in which you chose to finish each side story or acquire each archetype is more or less meaningless. I want to repeat that fundamental point because it's something that's come up in previous videos and I think it can be made relevant for almost any genre. If a game asks the player to decide between various options, but they're allowed to explore every option in a single playthrough eventually anyway, then it's not a meaningful decision. The only choice involved is in choosing which order to cross things off your list, and whether that's a list of map markers, a list of skills and perks, or a list of character bonds that need maxing out, picking the order of completion is almost never an interesting choice. Anyway, I'll spare you the usual open world rant. The relevant point for this video is that Metaphor never gives the player any difficult decisions to make, or conflicting options to choose between, and right now, I'm struggling to think of a single meaningful choice the player has to make across an entire playthrough. Here's an idea off the top of my head for what a meaningful choice could have looked like. The highest level of some archetypes has two separate manifestations. For instance, the Knight archetype tree has both the Paladin and the Dark Knight, both of which can be acquired whenever the player has the relevant requirements and has maxed out the bond of the Knight companion, Hulkenberg. But what if you could only unlock one of these in a single playthrough, and the one you were given depended on your choices and dialogue options throughout Hulkenberg's Bond chapters? Her side story sees her confronting an old colleague in a duel over what it means to be a true knight. Maybe if you could encourage her to execute or spare him after her victory, or better yet, if she made the decision for herself based on your responses in all of your conversations with her, then the outcome could determine which of the ultimate knight archetypes you ended up unlocking. This is a basic example, but perhaps you can see what a difference it makes for the player to be given a permanent choice between A or B, as opposed to A and then eventually B as well a little bit later just for a treat. The first is an actual meaningful decision that affects your playthrough. The second is a meaningless vehicle for drip-feeding content. Perhaps the player's relationship with the furry brothers could have benefited from this kind of lasting input as well. Since they travel with you for so long before Dell dies and Baz joins you, your interactions with them could have determined which one ended up dying and which one ended up becoming your final party member, with a different archetype available for each. Maybe if you didn't devote any of your time slots to thawing their standoffish demeanour, they both could have died, or even remained as enemies, allied with Luis against you. Now, I want to give the usual disclaimer and assure you that I'm not trying to say that these ideas are amazing and original, or that I'm some kind of game design genius. In fact, it wouldn't shock me if the devs wanted to do something exactly like this, but then ran out of time or money and had to leave it on the cutting room floor. But my point in creating these hypotheticals is just to show what meaningful player choices with meaningful consequences could have looked like within Metaphor's already existing framework, and I had to make some up because there are none in the game. By now I've done plenty of complaining about how Metaphor failed to satisfy my expectations, and while I do think the game shoulders a lot of the blame for giving me those expectations, I am also part of that equation, and you may think it's not entirely fair of me to criticize the game for not living up to the potential I imagined for it. So with that in mind, let's zoom out a bit and look at the game as a whole and on its own terms for what we know it's trying to do. You'll recall that the plot concerns a royal tournament in a fantasy kingdom, where the contestant with the most public support by the end will end up being crowned. Your popularity rating is occasionally shown improving as your renown grows, and you can also check it at any time with the press of a dedicated button, so as you can clearly see, it's a very important part of the game, and definitely not a feature of zero consequence that can be completely ignored by the player. Your main rival in this contest is the villain Luis, whose vision for the future of the kingdom is a sort of social Darwinism that will force the strong to rise to the top and the weak to wither and die. Most of the other candidates get barely any screen time at all and decide to drop out of the race after meeting you on the road exactly once, although a couple of them do have more well-defined principles to point towards, like the elf supremacist or the furry who wants justice for her downtrodden people. But while the game goes to great lengths to make sure you understand exactly why all of these ideologies are bad, when it comes to what you and your party actually believe in, there is a deafening and conspicuous silence. During dialogue, you're occasionally asked to respond to questions about what you intend to do with power once you win the kingdom, and the only answer you're really allowed to give is that you want everything to be nice and for everyone to be happy. It's boring, it doesn't mean anything, and it has nothing whatsoever to say about the way that politics really works. The party's common refrain of "we have to help everyone" is equally meaningless. And it's not even true, since there's a dungeon near the end that sees you killing bandits in copious numbers just to get the bounty on their leader's head. And wouldn't you know it, the central premise of the game has already fallen apart and I'm back to complaining about the pieces again. From a quick glance or a read of a plot synopsis, you might be fooled into thinking that this story is about the pursuit of power, or the corruption of ideals, or the clash of incompatible philosophies. But despite surface appearances, the truth is that Metaphor has precious little to say on any of these subjects, and even less for the player to actually interact with through gameplay systems. Being a ruler is complicated. You have to balance your responsibilities to the state alongside the promises you made to the people who helped you get there, people who you will find yourself at the mercy of if they withdraw their support. Juggling the wishes of various interest groups and trying to keep each one on your side is a delicate matter, and in the zero-sum game of politics, you're eventually going to be faced with some impossible decisions. You'll notice, however, that I'm using footage from a different game to illustrate this point, because nothing of this complexity is present in Metaphor. The popularity ranking I mentioned a minute ago is a number that pops up on the screen when you complete main or side quests, as if to imply that some meaningful mechanical interaction has taken place, but this number has no effect whatsoever on the gameplay or story, and it might as well not exist. My guess would be that this is a remnant of a more involved popularity system that ended up being scrapped during development. Maybe one that forced you to spend time slots on activities to manage your popularity among various groups. Assuming it's true that something was cut here, and I think it's very likely that it is, then the loss of those popularity mechanics is right up there next to teleportation in the list of Metaphor's biggest disappointments, since it's their absence that really prevents the game from being about anything. And without such a purpose, Metaphor ends up being a pointless fantasy. And once you've accused a game of that, there's not a lot it can do to redeem itself, is there? The game throws out a few plot twists in the back half, I guess to check whether you're still paying attention or not, but these all fell flat for me. I already mentioned the senseless revelation that you were secretly playing as the prince the whole time. And by the way, isn't it ironic that a contest supposedly about the will of the people ends with the king's son succeeding him anyway? Around the same time, another twist is revealed that this fantasy setting is actually our own world a few centuries after an apocalyptic event that followed the discovery of magic. Anyone playing with their eyes open should have seen this coming from about 50 hours away, but even if it had been a surprise, I don't think I would have cared because there's nothing intriguing about Metaphor's world and nothing worth caring about or getting invested in. The different fantasy races you'll meet around the world aren't exactly imaginative. People with elf ears, people with horns, old people, people with big eyes, people with 3 eyes, people with wings, bat people, and furries. These different races hate each other because they just do, okay? Don't think too hard about it. They hate each other and they love vaping. You might be tempted to say that there's no need to complain so much about these shortcomings. The game and its story are just bits of fanciful escapism that aren't meant to be taken so seriously.
Of course not, you muppet. It's a fantasy, remember?
Well, my response to that would be, the game is literally called Metaphor, and it couldn't wear its intentions more clearly on its sleeve without getting a name tag printed. It desperately wants to have something to say about our world and something to leave the player to chew on after seeing the credits, but it just doesn't. In the original rough notes I made while playing the game, I wrote that the characters in Metaphor are harder to empathise with because their fantastical struggles are a lot less immediately relatable than the more realistic ones of Persona. I still think there's some truth to that, as everything is just a bit more cartoony, and there's an additional layer of disbelief you have to suspend in order to even try and take it seriously. But after some reflection, I don't think Metaphor necessarily had to end up as a less relatable experience. The fact that it did is a failure of execution, not of concept. What the game is sorely missing is some kind of emotional interactions between characters. The fact that they spend so much of the runtime cooped up together in a land runner and yet barely seem to speak to each other is a pretty big blind spot if you ask me. The protagonist is a similar non-entity. We spend the first 3/4 of the game believing that we're working on behalf of our childhood friend, the Prince, a character who literally has no name and only has dialogue in a single flashback scene. When these two complete non-characters were merged into one, I had zero reason to care about it, so I didn't. I've praised the plot thread regarding the furry brothers and their change of heart, and it's not because I think it's especially deep or well done, it's just that it's the only thing resembling any sort of character arc in Metaphor, so I have to keep returning to it when providing examples. Without an empathetic core to ground it, and without any kind of thematic through line or focus point for the story to revolve around, Metaphor's narrative is completely unmoored and goes absolutely nowhere, and the occasional redeeming qualities like the world-building vistas or the slow unfolding of the furry brothers' relationship aren't even close to picking up the slack. I'll repeat the question I asked right at the beginning. What's the point of this fantasy? Metaphor is not a game about politics, it's not a game about time being precious, and it's definitely not a game about going on a journey. It's a game about nothing, an excuse to string together a bunch of dungeons with some cool boss designs and call it a day. And now with all that complaining about the story out of the way, there's nothing left but to get into the combat system, since it's the only part of the game that has any hope of hooking the player and getting them invested. Fortunately, it does a pretty good job of keeping the player engaged on the short-term level of individual battles, and there is a bit of long-term strategizing to do as well, both in each dungeon and across an entire playthrough. But before I dive into it, a quick intermission to go over a few scattered observations about Metaphor's presentation that didn't really fit in anywhere else. Firstly, one disappointing turn is that I found a lot of the music to be quite generic. It didn't grab me and worm its way into my every waking moment like Persona's bangers did, which is a bit of a letdown given that it's the same composer, but I know it isn't really fair to hold every game he composes for to such a ridiculously high standard. For what it's worth, Metaphor's soundtrack did grow on me over time, and I occasionally caught myself humming one theme or another while getting ready in the morning, but I suppose that will probably happen with anything you spend 100 hours listening to. Even so, there are a few standout tracks that are deserving of legitimate praise for their inventive deployment of vocals, used more like an extra instrument in combination with the others than as a lyric delivery vehicle. The Island Village theme is a highlight for that, and it's quite memorable as a result. The main combat themes are sweeping and dramatic enough to stay engaging after the hundreds of listens they're sure to get, and the addition of those chanting vocals gives them a feeling of urgency that really succeeds at pulling you in and making you feel some of the tension that's implied by the events on the screen. So the music may not be able to reach the heights of Persona, but at least there isn't any of the anime cringe that I love to hate on so much, right? Well, I have some bad news for you. But at least we can be thankful that since none of the characters are literally schoolgirls, the devs didn't feel the need to fill the game with unnecessary fan service of them. I spent enough time griping about this in my Persona video, so I don't think it's worth re-litigating those complaints a second time, but just know that if I wanted to, I could make another minute-long anime grunt montage. I won't, but I could. Mercifully, there are no romance options in this game, so we're all spared the embarrassment of seeing what that would have looked like. And on the subject of not having options, there are a couple of bad ending choices you can make, but they're so laughably cheap, I'm not sure why the devs even bothered. If you select the wrong dialogue option during one of your final confrontations with the game's villain, Luis, you get a couple of lines from your surprised party members, then a black screen with some text and a credit roll. What was the point of including this? It's obvious what response the game wants from you, so anyone getting this ending is doing it on purpose just to see what happens. And what happens is nothing. This isn't the only spot where the game's predictability works against it, and you can quite easily guess plot points ahead of time if you have any knowledge of how the Persona games work. The party member who joins you right at the beginning, Grius, has no bond to level up, which is a surefire sign that he's going to be killed off somewhere close to the story's inciting incident, and I doubt anybody was surprised when exactly that happened. Your mileage may vary on this, depending on how much prior knowledge of the mechanics you bring to the equation, but in any case, I think it's further evidence that copying over too much from previous projects can only work against a new one. Alright, that's enough stalling, let's move on to the combat. I've mentioned a few times by now that Metaphor carries over a little too much from Persona for its own good, but fortunately when it comes to combat and dungeon crawling, which make up at least half of the game's runtime, there are some major departures from the Persona formula that keep the experience fresh and prevent it from feeling like a total rehash. Don't get me wrong, Metaphor's battles will still look very familiar to anyone who's played a Persona game, but it has enough twists of its own that I spent the first 5 hours saying, "Oh," whenever a new mechanic fell into place and the new possibilities became clear to me. While it won't take you too long to get comfortable with these new systems, there's a steady drip of new options that are slowly opened to you, which means that there's almost always something new to experiment with or long-term goals to be planning towards. Once you've got access to the highest rank of abilities and gear, the game does become a bit too easy, and the emphasis on careful tactical choices is weakened when you can use the same dominant strategy for every fight. But a few super tough optional bosses in the endgame help to fill in the gaps here and keep things interesting. Now, just before I jump in and start breaking down how this all works, I should say that I haven't played any other Atlus RPGs besides Persona, so if Metaphor is borrowing ideas from any of them, then I'm probably not aware of it. As far as my experience goes, the changes made in Metaphor are new to me, so that's how I'll treat them. First on our list of new mechanics is the archetype system, which works quite a bit differently from the personas you might be used to. Each party member needs to be assigned an archetype that will dictate their abilities, stats, and weaknesses while in combat. It costs you some currency every time they learn a new one, so you're incentivized to specialize each character with just a few archetypes in order to avoid wasting resources. On top of that, party members will only earn XP for the archetype they currently have equipped, and unless you want to spend your entire life grinding, there's only so much XP you'll earn over a playthrough, so you'll want to think ahead and make sure each character has an archetype equipped that fits into your grand plan for them and the party as a whole. That said, the game is very generous with XP granting consumables that can be used to quickly level up new archetypes, so your decisions about which ones to invest in are never permanent across a playthrough. This archetype system is a good way of getting around the wildcard problem from Persona, where the hugely overpowered main character has access to dozens of different skills at once with basically no weaknesses. In Metaphor, you have to choose a specialty for each character and figure out how to make them work together best. In order to prevent every party member from becoming a jack of all trades, they each have their own base stats that make them more suited for certain archetypes over others. A higher magic stat will make a more efficient mage or healer, for instance. Crucially though, you can still put any archetype on any character, which I think is an important way of giving the player both the responsibility to make sensible choices, but also the freedom to break rules if they deem it necessary. With just one or two possible exceptions, each archetype has its unique strengths that make all of them worth dabbling in at least a bit. Their roles will mostly look familiar to anyone who's spent some time with Persona, though here each archetype specializes in exactly one area of combat. The commander buffs your party, the faker debuffs enemies, the knight attracts attention and soaks up damage, the brawler expends HP to perform powerful physical attacks. You get the idea. The masked dancer archetype was one that didn't initially seem all that useful to me, but I came to appreciate the value of casting elemental weaknesses on enemies when I got to the more difficult optional bosses in the final stretch of the game. The merchant, which increases your chances of finding rare items after battles, didn't strike me as particularly helpful, but I can imagine how another player might find a use for its ability to spend money on unblockable attacks. On the whole, the variety of archetypes is pretty good, and there are tons of synergies to discover and complementary strategies to develop by using them in tandem. But the feature that really pulls everything together and adds a huge amount of tactical depth is the ability to carry over, or inherit, a small number of skills between archetypes. You can inherit up to 4 skills on each archetype, depending on the level of your bond with the corresponding companion character, and inheriting a skill is another thing that costs some currency, so you need to think carefully about which ones will be most useful to you, and you're also further nudged into thinking long term about your wider strategy for which archetypes and which skills should be assigned to each character. When you consider that across all the archetypes there are skills for attacking, healing, buffing, debuffing, casting status effects, curing status effects, creating weaknesses, casting shields, drawing aggro, rearranging your party's formation, maybe you can see just how much room there is here to get creative while mixing and matching abilities using your limited inheritance slots. My only very minor nitpick in all this is that each time you unlock a new archetype for a party member, that archetype starts with all of its inheritance slots empty, and you have to manually go in and assign them. It's easy to forget to do this and end up running into battle under-equipped, which can be a bit annoying and could easily have been fixed by taking the player straight to the inheritance menu every time they unlock a new archetype. It's really not a big deal, and I probably wouldn't even mention it if it wasn't for the fact that this isn't the only bit of cumbersome menu usage in the game, and trust me when I said that the other menu issues are much worse than this one. Moving on to the next feature of combat that's new to Metaphor, we have the turn counter system, which presents the player with a few strategic trade-offs to make as they consider how to use each of their moves. At the start of each round of combat, you have a number of tokens equal to your number of party members, and as you might expect, performing regular abilities and attacks depletes the count by 1. Unless, that is, your attack hits an enemy's weakness, in which case it only consumes half a token, leaving the other half for you to use on an additional move. This effect can stack, meaning that attacks on enemy weaknesses will always consume half of a full token if there's one available, and if you get a full sweep of weakness hits, it's possible to double the amount of turns you get in a round. Not that that's particularly likely to happen, since with 3 different types of physical attack and 6 types of magic, there's a lot of ground to cover when strategizing and planning which abilities to assign to each party member. But the point is that going for hits on enemy weaknesses is heavily incentivized and is pretty much always a good idea, so a lot of your tactics during individual battles will be centered around the best way to exploit the advantages and extra turns that come from it. And this isn't the only quirk that arises from the turn counter system. You can also choose to skip a character's turn for only half a token, which can sometimes come in handy if they don't have any options that are useful to you, or if the character next in line has a skill that's in higher demand. The factor that really adds another dimension of strategy to Metaphor's turn counters, however, is the option of using synthesis skills, powerful abilities that rope in multiple characters to consume MP from, and also cost more than 1 token to use. The synthesis skills you have available to you in any given battle depend on the exact archetypes you have in your current team, so they're yet another thing that pushes you towards thinking strategically about your party's archetypes. Early in a playthrough, these synthesis skills are the only way to attack multiple enemies at once, unlike in Persona, where you can do so for just a slightly higher MP cost than single target attacks. In Metaphor, it costs more MP, and the MP drains from multiple characters, and it means you have to give up multiple turn counters, and therefore some of your moves during your round of combat. While these synthesis skills are essential for taking down enemies quickly and avoiding damage, they chew through MP fast, so you need to be very careful and tactical with their use. Thankfully, the weakness rule still applies here, so if your synthesis attack hits an enemy's weakness, then it only consumes half tokens, not full ones. I'm sure you can see the trade-offs and careful choices that emerge out of this token mechanic, and with all of these options at your disposal for passing turns around and getting extra moves from well-placed attacks on weaknesses, you can pull off a lot of Hail Marys that you would never see in a more rigid, single-turn system. One great example of this in action is that you'll start subconsciously tracking how many turn counters it will take you to get back to your healer, and adjust your strategy accordingly, depending on whether you want to heal and whether you have the counters to spare. The ability to either be stingy or generous with your counters during any given round adds a lot of depth to the combat, and this remains the case throughout an entire playthrough. The archetypes and turn counters are without a doubt the most impactful additions to combat that are new to Metaphor, but there are a few minor changes worth mentioning as well. Buffs and debuffs to attack, defense, or agility were present in Persona, but Metaphor introduces the idea of multiple ranks of buffs and debuffs, which adds a bit more depth to the concept through some interesting trade-offs. You or your enemies can be strengthened or weakened up to 3 levels in each category, and the arrows in the UI make it effortless to read and plan around this. The ability to see exactly when a buff or debuff is about to expire is also indispensable, as it gives you the opportunity to make more informed decisions. How low should you try to get that enemy's defense before you start attacking? When your party has been debuffed, should you wait for it to expire after a few rounds, or is it worth it to spend some MP and a turn counter on removing it instantly? Especially against the difficult late game bosses, these are some of the questions you have to answer and re-answer in every round of combat, and on top of everything else, it adds a nice little fold of complexity. As well as choosing which archetypes and skills you want to take into battle, you also have to make calls about what gear to put on your party, and weapons, armor, and charms will often add abilities or resistances on top of the usual stat increases, meaning that you can spend quite a lot of time in the menu moving gear around to maximize its usefulness. I like that certain powerful equipment is only available to purchase a single time, since it stops you from relying too much on gear and forces you to make strategic choices about who equips what. And this is on top of certain gear only being equipable by certain archetypes. Unfortunately though, while I'm on the subject, this is another area of the game where the menu has an incredibly frustrating oversight. While shopping for new gear, you can't see the stat bonuses of your currently equipped items inside the shop screen, so if you want to make informed comparisons, then you have to constantly go in and out of the menu to keep checking numbers. This is such a stupid waste of time, and over a playthrough it really starts to grate and makes you want to avoid going shopping. Returning to the combat features that are new to Metaphor, next on the list is the addition of formation rows. This lends yet another tactical layer to battles, as being in the back row increases defense, while the front row decreases defense but increases physical damage. There are a few tricks to learn regarding these rows, and a few skills that cause all party members to move forward or back, which can be quite handy in a pinch, but sooner or later you'll realise that there's a clearly dominant strategy here. Since being at the front is only a benefit if you're performing a physical attack on that specific turn, you might as well keep everyone at the back as much as possible and just move them forward on the specific turn they're going to be attacking, since moving rows is a free action anyway. Once you've figured this out, formation rows no longer bring an interesting dimension to the combat, and I think a bit more depth could have been teased out here if changing rows cost you something, maybe half a turn counter. Or better yet, if your position affected more than just defense and physical attack values. The final feature I'll mention is the rewind button, which lets you click the left stick to return to the beginning of a battle and start it again from the top, which almost sounds like a good idea, but for some unfathomable, indecipherable, baffling reason, restarting the battle like this just takes you straight back to turn 1 without getting a chance to reassign your archetypes, making it more or less useless. If you're in a battle with an ordinary enemy, you're better off just escaping the battle, changing your party, and jumping back in with the cards now stacked in your favour. If you're in a boss fight that isn't going your way and you want to quickly escape and try it again with a more appropriate party, well, you can't. All you can do is wait for the boss to kill you so you can get sent back outside the boss door to respec and try it again. This is so close to being a useful feature, but in a game where the vast majority of your strategy relies on the choices you made before entering combat, being able to restart a battle without getting a chance to tweak those choices is utterly pointless, and I really don't understand how this could ever be useful. Despite that glaring nitpick, I hope I've made it clear that there's a lot for the player to keep track of during combat, with plenty of options and plenty of ways to approach any given problem in battle. The choices you make about which archetypes to assign to your team beforehand give you a lot of control over your broader strategy, while the tactical decisions within battles offer tons of room to play around and look for the most efficient ways of taking down each group of enemies. And being efficient in battle is an essential part of Metaphor, because just like in Persona, you have to take into account the meta consideration of preserving MP and consumables between battles as you make your way to the boss at the end of a dungeon. Which means it's time to move the discussion up a level and talk about how the player approaches each dungeon as a whole, rather than just individual battles. The emphasis on conserving MP may be nothing new, but Metaphor brings quite a few fresh ideas to this side of the game too. That's not to say all of those ideas are successful, but I appreciate the attempt at innovation nonetheless. One idea that I think works very well is the generous XP and currency bonus you get for winning battles unscathed, since it provides a strong incentive to spend your precious MP on beating enemies quickly, and pushes you to look for the most cost-effective way of doing so. Again, just like in Persona, there's a tension between wanting to save your limited MP for the boss and being forced to spend it to defeat enemies, which makes for a compelling driving force as you move through a dungeon, and by the time that wave crests in the boss, you should be feeling a little bit nervous about whether you still have enough MP left. Consumables that restore MP are relatively rare, and if you run out before reaching the end of a dungeon, you'll have no choice but to exit and come back the next day, which is obviously something you want to avoid at all costs, given that time is a strictly limited resource. The only time I had to do this was during the first major dungeon, which for some reason is the longest one in the game, and of course the one where your party members' stats and MP limits are at their lowest. Sometimes you'll randomly get a full refresh of health and MP mid-level if you hit a story beat, which sounds like a good thing, but it can actually be pretty frustrating if you've just used an incredibly rare item to restore MP only to find a few minutes later that you wasted it. But anyway, on the whole, the incentives around resources and MP conservation are much the same as in Persona, and with the addition of the unscathed bonus, there are enough long-term consequences in play to keep every move in combat feeling meaningful. One very striking difference from Persona, however, is the sort of hybrid real-time combat that you'll find yourself using whenever you're in a dungeon, which looks like it would be a big deal, but it isn't really, and it also kind of sucks. In terms of control, it's not much more complicated than just hammering the attack button while throwing out the occasional dodge, but at least the ability to quickly zip towards enemies while locked on is a nice little feature. The way it works is essentially that you need to hit an enemy enough times to fill their stun bar, after which you can press a button to ambush them and enter turn-based combat with a huge advantage. Technically, you can press that button to enter turn-based combat at any time, but because of the massive benefit that comes from stunning first, and the relative ease with which you can do so, it's pretty much always worth it. If an enemy hits you, you also enter turn-based combat, but the enemy side gets the first move. If this happens, it's basically always a good idea to escape combat and re-enter it again on your own terms. And this is because the difference between ambushing and being ambushed is absolutely monumental. Succeeding at it means you deal a big chunk of free damage to every enemy, and you start the battle with all of them in a stunned state, meaning they skip their first turn and you can get 2 full rounds of attacks in before they snap out of it. It's not uncommon for this very charitable stun mechanic to lead to a long string of battles where the enemies don't get to perform even a single move. That probably sounds kind of boring, and yet it's not, because every move in combat still costs you something in MP and is therefore meaningful, so you still feel that tension of heading deeper and deeper into danger as your MP starts running low. What is boring, however, is attacking enemies in real time that are a lower level than you and finding that you can just auto-kill them without entering combat for free XP and money with 0 MP cost to you. Along with the fact that dungeon enemies respawn, this creates the same perverse incentive that was present in Persona to make the most of every dungeon visit by grinding them for XP and other resources. This problem is so bad that you can even end up being over-leveled completely by mistake. I entered a new dungeon, the Catacombs, for the first time ever and found that I was already strong enough to auto-kill most of the enemies, which just seems wrong to me, and meant that my time in this dungeon was a tedious exercise of hammering the attack button and occasionally picking up items, with no tactical or resource management decisions to make whatsoever. Later on, there's a scene where you and your companions are imprisoned and you have to free them from their cells one by one. And I guess you're supposed to feel your power and capability slowly returning as each member rejoins you. In reality, however, this doesn't land at all, because you're just insta-killing all the enemies by yourself anyway. Now I can just see the comments from doubters telling me that this is my fault for over-leveling myself, but look, the rules of the game, that were set by the developers and not by me, encourage you to do this. If you beat the boss at the end of a dungeon with some MP left over, and one of your characters is just a few XP from leveling up, why not stick around in the dungeon for a little longer and kill a few more of the respawning enemies before leaving? There's nothing to lose and everything to gain by doing so, and you might unlock a new skill that will put you in a better position for the next dungeon. And it's just sensible to try and get as much XP as you can during every dungeon visit, since there are only so many days in the calendar. In its defense, Metaphor does have a mechanism that's supposed to counteract this and prevent overleveling, as killing weaker enemies gives you less XP once you're too many levels above them, but if the point of this is to prevent the player from getting too OP through grinding, then why not just stop enemies from respawning and make grinding impossible to begin with? As always, my key point here is that choices are only meaningful if they have consequences that cost you something. If using an ability to kill an enemy will consume more MP but net you an unscathed bonus, that's a meaningful choice. If you can slash mindlessly at enemies and get a bunch of free XP for it, that's not a meaningful choice. So far, I've mostly praised the archetype system as a source of meaningful choices, since there are tons of decisions to make about which skills to inherit and which synergies you want to take advantage of in combat. That's certainly true on the level of individual battles, but is sadly completely undermined on the dungeon layer by the fact that you can pause and change archetypes at any time outside of combat. What this means is that you can enter a battle, find out the opponent's weakness, then escape the battle and redesign your party specifically to tear them to pieces. To be clear, doing this is very boring, and is tedious enough that I think most players will avoid it and just struggle through with their current loadout, which is obviously a lot more interesting as it forces the player to improvise a path to success with imperfect tools. But the fact that this time-wasting option is available at all is not a good thing, and there will be occasions where you'll come up against an enemy that you're just not remotely equipped for. In those cases, if you want to avoid wasting tons of MP, then you basically have no choice but to escape and spend some time in the menu designing a new loadout. When you come up against a boss you're not quite ready for, Being killed by it early on is pretty much the best thing that could happen to you, because it's then trivial to re-equip yourself with skills that exploit their weakness and effortlessly dogpile them on the second try. This early mini-boss of 5 floating eye things was practically impossible for me to beat with the melee-focused party I had when I first unknowingly walked into it. After rearranging my party for my second try, I wrecked it in a single turn. Given my thoughts about decisions needing consequences to be meaningful, maybe you can guess where I'm going with this. Allowing the player to change archetypes for free mid-dungeon was a big mistake. If you weren't able to do that, then the choices you made about your loadout before venturing into danger would actually be lasting and meaningful, and improvising a way forward using the skills you brought with you would be a lot more interesting. If you ran into an enemy you really couldn't deal with, your options would be to use up a bunch of resources fighting it imperfectly, avoid it entirely, or end your dungeon run and come back tomorrow at the cost of losing a day. These are all choices with actual consequences, as opposed to the current, obviously dominant strategy of leaving a difficult battle only to re-enter it and steamroll it with more appropriate skills. What I find ironic about this is that there's quite a big emphasis on preparation in this game, and even a system for gathering intel before heading into a dungeon, which ostensibly is there to encourage you to plan ahead and consider as many factors as possible to avoid being caught out. I find this a really interesting concept in theory that shifts a lot of the problem-solving burden out of combat itself and into the careful allocation of roles, skills and equipment ahead of time. But the need to actually do any of this preparation is absolutely obliterated by the ability to change your loadout after the fact anyway. Once you're inside a dungeon, you're allowed to just react to what you find inside, and any preparation you did beforehand was a pointless waste of time. You can see that there's a major contradiction here. There are these goblin guys who hate staff wielders for some reason and will fly into a frenzy if you have a mage or healer in your party. You can learn this ahead of time by paying an informant, and it seems like crucial info to have, doesn't it? Except, once you're inside the dungeon, there are NPCs just standing around who will tell you for free anyway, and if you did come inside with a mage or healer, you can open the menu and assign them another role with no trouble at all. So again I ask, what was the point of preparing beforehand? The way you gather that intel is a bit lacking in inspiration too. Walking up to a town's informant and buying everything from their menu is a ritual that gets old after doing it once, but you have to do it again every time you reach a new settlement. Maybe needing a certain bond level, or choosing certain dialogue options, or having to spend some time slots on snooping for info would have been a more interesting way of implementing this. I also find it very annoying that the quest screen will just straight up tell you which archetypes are recommended for each dungeon. Apparently, you don't even have to bother interpreting the intel you get from informants, since the game will just do it for you. Yet another part of this game where paying attention is made pointless. Thankfully, there are a few parts where the concept of preparing for battle ahead of time gets a bit of exploration and leads to some interesting scenarios. For instance, sometimes a boss will unexpectedly change its behaviour or resistances midway through a battle, which prompts the player to adapt to the changes off the cuff and improvise a way through using whatever skills they have to hand. The optional one-on-one battle with Lena in the Colosseum is a fight that takes a lot of iterative refinement in your preparation to find a successful strategy, and it really made me wish for a way to quit out of boss battles, since it was usually immediately obvious that a strategy wasn't working, but I had to wait several turns for Lena to kill me before I was allowed to try again. With only a single character at your disposal, you have to be very specific with your plan and know exactly how you're going to counter each of her moves ahead of time. Which is why it's kind of bullshit that she starts casting a repel effect halfway through, since you'll need to die and redesign your loadout yet again for a move that came out of nowhere. I approve of throwing out unexpected changes in the middle of combat, but in the severely restricted circumstances of having only a single party member, it feels a bit cheap, and is basically impossible to react to organically in the moment. Bringing up an unexpected change mid-battle can go both ways then, but when used with care, I think it can be a great way of challenging the player and preventing them from getting complacent, sort of like a boss fight's second phase in a Souls game. For a very bad example of how to escalate challenge, we can look at a few of the other optional battles. The final one in the Colosseum is kind of ridiculous, as the boss starts getting 4 moves per round. If you don't know it's coming and haven't already prepared for it, this can lead to a ridiculous damage curve that you won't have time to heal your way out of. And this is far from the worst case of the devs leaning on this trick of giving bosses loads of turns as an easy way of ramping up difficulty. There's an optional quest in the endgame that sees you killing a bunch of dragons in some reused dungeons, then taking on a kind of shadow version of yourself. Yeah, I know, original, isn't it? And when you get him low on health, he'll start giving himself 7 moves per round. Yes, you heard that right. And if he hits weaknesses with those moves, it could be as high as 10. This is fucking ludicrous, and I don't think it's the right way to increase difficulty in a turn-based combat system. What pissed me off even more about this boss fight is that it locks you out of using certain tools in a really underhanded and cheap way. On my first try against him, I got him to about half health but kept taking hits on a key character's weakness to wind attacks. So, I had the bright idea to equip that character with an item that repelled wind. Pretty sensible idea, right? Well, no, it turns out you're not allowed to do this, because the boss will simply insta-kill your entire party on the first turn if you dare to enter his arena with a repel item equipped. To make this even worse, the game doesn't have the grace to tell you why this is happening, and I had to Google it to find out. This is an absolutely atrocious bit of game design, and it deserves every ounce of venom I can muster. It's the final optional challenge of the game, the crowning triumph of the combat system that should be showcasing it at its best, and it's fucking broken. Need I say more? Soon I'll begin wrapping up my thoughts on combat and then the game more generally, but just before I do, I want to return to a more positive note, because despite the awfulness of that optional shadow boss, the 3 dragons you have to fight beforehand are perhaps the most enjoyable of the game's preparation challenges, if I can call them that. Each dragon is overpowered enough that you're likely to get completely wiped almost immediately into your first exploratory attempt, which means your goal is to think carefully and figure out a way to counteract each of their stupidly OP moves. How to avoid the insta-kill Pillar of Fire, how to stop the boss overwhelming you with 3 full ranks of attack buffs, how to avoid your party members getting charmed and killing each other. Since all of these moves are made visible to the player early on, I found these dragons to be a mostly fair challenge, and they don't have an obvious weakness that you can design your party around, so you need to show some real creativity to work out a solution that counters their moves, while still dealing enough damage of your own to secure a victory before you run out of MP. Against the Ice Dragon, I kept getting into trouble early on because I had a party member who was weak to ice, and kept giving the boss extra moves whenever she got hit. It already does 4 moves on each turn, so the last thing I needed was that number going up to 5, 6, or even 7. I had to find a way around the problem. First I tried equipping a talisman that raised evasion against ice attacks, but a chance-based strategy wasn't reliable enough, so I swapped her out of the party and moved some healing skills around. That still wasn't enough, and I was close to giving up and returning later with a few more levels when I had the idea of putting a knight in the party to soak up all the single target attacks. The dragon will reliably cast an attack buff on itself anytime its attack isn't at max, so removing that buff on my turn was a surefire way to force it to waste a move on recasting it. Little tricks like these will all compound together to give you the edge and finally overcome it. It's tough, but crucially it's predictable, and there are no nasty surprises waiting at half health to throw you off your strategy and force you back to the drawing board. So perhaps you can see why I think there's definite potential in this preparation-based combat, but as with so much of this game, the concept isn't pushed far enough for anything truly interesting to fall out of it. Most combat problems have a vast number of ways you can solve them, by rearranging your archetypes, your inherited skills, your equipped gear, or with the clever application of consumables, buffs, and turn counters. Whatever choices you make, they usually come at the expense of filling a slot or using a resource that could have been used for something else, which makes those choices meaningful, at least on the level of individual battles. But that's exactly my key criticism here. Because you can change your loadout at any time during a dungeon, each battle can be treated and prepared for individually, which means that any pre-dungeon preparation you did was a pointless waste of time. You still have to keep track of your MP during dungeons and manage that resource effectively, but to anyone that's played an RPG before, that's hardly a new concept. When it comes to the new concepts that Metaphor actually is bringing to the table, archetypes are left out of that dungeon-wide planning layer, and the game's apparent emphasis on preparation is completely undermined. Funnily enough, this parallels the criticism I had of the game's narrative. Combat works fine and has a lot of depth on a battle-by-battle basis, but as in the story, there's no wider through line and very few choices to make that have lasting consequences. No matter what archetypes you've chosen to unlock for each character throughout your playthrough, Once you're into the endgame, you're heavily nudged into using their unique ultimate archetype, which means the only impact your choices across the game will have is in the 4 inherited skills you pick for it. Preparing for combat becomes even less of a concern when you reach this point, even for individual battles, primarily due to the frankly way too overpowered abilities on the protagonist's Prince archetype. With the Prince assigned to the main character, he can serve as the counterpart to any other party member's synthesis abilities, so you never need to give another thought to party configuration. The Prince has 0 weaknesses and also comes equipped with plenty of almighty attacks, which ignore all resistances and will deal massive damage to any enemy or boss without exception. With that in mind, I naturally gravitated towards a strategy of maximizing the power of those almighty attacks, using my other party members to buff my attack, debuff the enemy defense, and keep everyone else healed up. Very simple, but very effective. By the time this overpowered one-size-fits-all strategy became available to me and every boss fight started feeling exactly the same, I was more than ready for the game to be over, and when the credits finally rolled, it came as a great relief. What's the point of fantasy? Like any work of fiction, the goal of fantasy is to use the unreal to expose some truth about the real. That's as true today as it was 3,000 years ago, and it's the reason our species has spent so many millennia telling each other made-up stories around the fire, or more recently, through the computer monitor. I think most viewers would agree, however, that not all fantasies are created equal. Not all are able to capture the imagination, to stir the emotions, or to rouse our sympathies with quite the same skill. And well, to skip straight to the punchline, I think I've demonstrated by now that Metaphor ReFantazio falls firmly in the category of stories that fail to give their audience something they can relate to, and is severely lacking in a point to make it all worthwhile. When it comes to the narrative, Metaphor has lofty ambitions and clearly wants to tell a grand story about politics and the corrupting influence of power. Why else would the devs have based the plot around a contest for royal authority? There's nothing wrong with that as a topic, and I think it could be a pretty refreshing subject for a game narrative, but Metaphor falls short of doing that topic justice in just about every way possible. Even putting gameplay to one side and looking purely at the plot in a vacuum, the story sees a team of bland and aimless characters coming together in support of a royal claimant who has no ideals to believe in, but apparently still wants to be king just because. At least the main antagonist has a philosophy I can point towards and comment on, but there isn't much to say there besides, yeah, social Darwinism is bad, isn't it? The other candidates in the contest get a minuscule amount of screen time between them, and I have to wonder if this is another area of the game that saw a lot of ideas getting scrapped during development. When we bring the actual gameplay into the discussion, things start looking even worse, and the player has absolutely no way whatsoever of engaging with the supposed theme of political change or ambition. There are never, ever any consequential choices for the player to make about what kind of leader they want to be, or which groups they want to court as their power base, or how to deal with any of the problems plaguing the kingdom. All you have to do is follow the main quest, tick off the occasional side quest, and watch your popularity rating constantly rise without ever having to make a decision. It doesn't matter what you do, you'll end the game being crowned king in exactly the same ending regardless. So what was the point of structuring the story like a contest and giving the player a meaningless number to track? The road trip side of the narrative is similarly lacking in consequence, and the ability to teleport around between major hubs means that distance is never a real concern for the player. It doesn't matter if you manage your time wisely at each leg of the journey or not, because you can always come back later with the extremely generous amount of free time you have throughout a playthrough. Again, I find myself asking, what was the point of structuring the game like an arduous journey across the kingdom and then letting the player teleport all over it anyway? Moving on to the combat, there are plenty of original ideas in Metaphor, and the interplay between archetypes, inherited skills, and smart use of turn counters can give the player quite a lot to think about, both when inside and when preparing for individual battles. On that small battle-by-battle scale, figuring out an appropriate loadout with the game's preparation mechanics can be quite satisfying, especially against the tougher challenges that require some real creativity to beat. But it starts to get old once you've figured out the dominant strategies that work in pretty much every situation. The game even pushes you towards converging on the same endgame loadout as every other player by giving you access to ultimate archetypes for each character in the final quarter, so the only impact your loadout choices throughout a playthrough will have on the finale is in which 4 skills you choose to carry over to each character's final form. And that brings me to the biggest problem I have with Metaphor's combat. The preparation mechanics that should be threaded through everything as the game's unique selling point never really escape from that small scale of individual battles. While the game seems to be encouraging you to plan ahead and gather info before going into a dungeon, there aren't actually any lasting consequences to the preparation you do, since you can change your archetypes and loadout at will once you're inside anyway. And one final time I have to ask, what is the point of urging the player to prepare for dungeons in advance if it makes literally no difference either way? I'm sure you've identified the theme emerging here, and the refrain that I keep returning to. When you look at it too closely, Metaphor reveals itself to be a game full of contradictions, and design choices that don't seem to harmonise together. Half of the reason for this is the structure that was carried over to this game from Persona, which ties it down to certain conventions and prevents it from doing its own thing. The bond system in particular doesn't really make sense in a story that's supposed to be about a journey across the land, and yet here it is forcing the rest of the game to bend itself around it. I suppose because it was just easier to bring over existing designs that the devs were already familiar with. The royal virtues are an uninspired feature also inherited directly from Persona, again seemingly just because the devs could do so with minimal effort. The other half of the responsibility for my disappointment with Metaphor is that the devs just didn't go far enough with the ideas that actually are new and innovative. Travel is undermined by the teleport, planning ahead for dungeons is undermined by the fact that you can change loadouts inside them anytime you like, and the choice of which archetypes to invest in is doubly undermined both by the ability to unlock everything eventually anyway, and the ultimate forms that you're pushed into using for the endgame. The gameplay of Metaphor is a mixture of the old and stale and the new but undercooked, and as a result, it isn't able to stand alone as a truly fresh or innovative experience. Pair that with an overambitious political narrative that goes nowhere and doesn't involve the player either emotionally or mechanically, and you have a recipe for disappointment that feels like it doesn't have any point to it. Despite the barrage of negativity I've unloaded in this conclusion, I don't hate Metaphor ReFantazio. The reason I was so let down by it after all was because of the huge amount of potential that I saw in its core premise. That potential still exists out there, just waiting to be harnessed, and I think there's still the spark of life in this ancient genre yet. But after sitting through 4 Atlus games in a row, I think I can safely say that I've got this RPG bug out of my system now, so at least I can thank Metaphor for that, and move on to playing something just a little bit shorter. Well, maybe just one more.